Broken Creek, Colorado Territory. September 1882. The autumn rains had been merciless for 3 days straight, turning the frontier settlement's main street into a river of mud that swallowed wagon wheels and claimed more than one unfortunate soul who'd misjudged its depth. The storm clouds hung low over the Rocky Mountain foothills like a gray wool blanket, heavy with the promise of even worse weather to come. Emma Hartwell pressed her swollen belly against the rough-hewn window frame of her cabin, watching sheets of rain slice through the dying light of evening. At 7 months pregnant, every movement required careful consideration, every step a deliberate choice between necessity and the growing exhaustion that seemed to live in her very bones.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The baby kicked restlessly beneath her ribs, as if sensing her unease, and Emma placed a calming hand over the spot where a tiny elbow or knee pushed against her stretched skin. The cabin sat at the edge of Broken Creek's scattered collection of weathered buildings, close enough to town for safety, but far enough away that Emma could pretend she didn't see the pitying looks from the other settlers when she ventured out for supplies. Her husband Jacob had built this place with his own hands 3 years ago when they'd first arrived from Kansas with dreams of starting fresh in the Colorado Territory. He'd chosen the location carefully, he'd said, where the creek bent around a stand of sturdy cottonwoods that would provide shade in summer and a windbreak in winter. Now Jacob lay buried beneath one of those same cottonwoods, claimed by a fever that had swept through the territory the previous spring like wildfire through dry grass. Emma had nursed him for 2 weeks, watching helplessly as the man who'd promised to build her a new life slipped away one breath at a time. The doctor from Denver had finally arrived 3 days after Jacob died, full of apologies and medical knowledge that came too late to matter. The other settlers had been kind in their way, bringing food and offering help with the harvest, but Emma knew their charity came with expectations. A pregnant widow was a burden the struggling community could ill afford, and more than one well-meaning neighbor had suggested she might consider returning to Kansas, to family who could provide for her and the coming child. What they didn't understand was that Kansas held nothing for her. Now her parents had died in the same cholera outbreak that had driven her and Jacob west, and her sister's husband had made it clear that another mouth to feed would strain their own meager resources, so Emma had chosen to stay, to make her stand in this wild territory where a woman's worth wasn't measured solely by the man who claimed her. She'd learned to tend the small vegetable garden Jacob had planted, to milk their single cow, to split kindling for the cook stove, even when her back ached and her ankles swelled like rising bread. The cabin's single room had become her entire world, its long walls a fortress against the uncertainty that waited beyond her door. The storm had started Tuesday morning with a gentle misting that Emma had welcomed after weeks of drought. By Tuesday afternoon, the gentle mist had become a steady downpour that drummed against the cabin's shake roof like thousands of impatient fingers. By Wednesday, the rain had turned violent, driving horizontally across the prairie with a force that made the cabin's walls shudder and groan. Emma had spent the morning trying to repair the leak that had opened up over her bed, standing precariously on a 3-legged stool while water dripped steadily onto the quilt her mother had sewn as a wedding gift. The patched oilcloth she'd managed to nail over the worst of the damage would hold for now, but she knew the entire roof needed attention before winter arrived in earnest. Her food stores were running dangerously low. The late vegetables from her garden had been ruined by the constant rain, and her last trip to Morrison's general store had cleaned out what remained of the money Jacob had hidden in their old coffee tin. $15.37 was all that stood between Emma and complete destitution, and even that meager sum wouldn't last through the month if she had to keep buying flour and bacon at Morrison's inflated prices. The cow, Bessie, had gone dry 2 weeks ago, another casualty of the difficult pregnancy that seemed to be draining strength from everything in Emma's small world. Without milk money, Without eggs from the chickens that had succumbed to a fox raid in August, Emma found herself living on beans and cornbread, stretching each meal as far as it would go while trying not to think about the growing life inside. Her that needed proper nourishment. She'd been a schoolteacher back in Kansas, educated and capable, but Broken Creek already had a teacher in the form of Mrs. Patterson, the minister's wife who'd held the position for 8 years and showed no signs of retiring. Emma had offered to help with the older children, thinking her experience with Latin and mathematics might be valuable, but Mrs. Patterson had politely declined, suggesting instead that Emma might consider taking in washing or mending to earn a few extra coins. The irony wasn't lost on Emma that she'd once corrected her students' grammar and taught them about the great literature of the world, and now she found herself contemplating whether she could afford to light the oil lamp after dark or if she should save the kerosene for truly necessary occasions. Pregnancy had a way of reducing even the most educated woman to her most basic needs: food, shelter, warmth, and the terrifying hope that somehow everything would work out for the best. But as Emma watched the rain turn the world outside her window into a gray blur of water and wind, she couldn't shake the feeling that her small store of hope was running as low as her dwindling supplies. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and Emma found herself whispering the same prayer she'd repeated countless times since Jacob's death. "Please God, just let me be strong enough. Just let me be enough." The knock came at Emma's door just after full darkness had settled over the territory, so soft and hesitant that at first she thought it might be a tree branch blown against the wood by the relentless wind. She sat perfectly still at her small kitchen table, mending one of Jacob's old shirts by the light of a single candle, listening for the sound to repeat itself. 3 gentle taps, then silence. Then 3 more, with a rhythm that spoke of human intention rather than random chance. Emma's heart began to race, not with fear exactly, but with the acute awareness that came to anyone living alone on the frontier. Visitors after dark usually meant trouble of one kind or another: bad news, desperate men, or worse. She moved carefully to the window, her pregnancy making stealth impossible, and peered through a crack in the shutters. The rain was still coming down in torrents, but in the brief moments when lightning illuminated the world beyond her door, she could make out 2 figures huddled on her small covered porch. One tall, one small, both soaked through despite the meager protection her roof overhang provided. The larger figure raised his hand to knock again, and in that instant of movement, Emma caught sight of something that made her breath catch. In her throat, dark skin, long black hair plastered to his skull by the rain, and clothing that marked him unmistakably as Indian. Not the civilized reservation Indians who sometimes came to town to trade, but someone who still dressed in the traditional way, with beaded leather and feathers that had somehow survived the storm's assault. Emma's first instinct was to step back from the window, to pretend she hadn't heard the knocking, to wait in silence until the strangers moved on to seek shelter elsewhere. The Colorado Territory was still raw and dangerous, filled with stories of Indian raids and settler families found scalped in their own homes. Every woman who'd chosen to make a life on the frontier had heard those stories, had imagined herself in those terrible scenarios. But as she watched the 2 figures through the storm, Emma noticed something that gave her pause. The larger man had wrapped his arms around the smaller figure, clearly trying to shield the child from the worst of the rain and wind. Even in the brief flashes of lightning, she could see the protective tenderness in his posture, the way he bent his own body to create a barrier between the elements and what was obviously his son. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, and even from her hiding place behind the shutters, Emma could see that he was shivering violently. His small frame was pressed tight against his father's side, seeking what warmth and comfort could be found in the middle of the storm that showed no signs of abating. Another flash of lightning revealed the man's face more clearly, and Emma found herself looking into features that seemed carved from the very mountains that surrounded their small settlement.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
High cheekbones, a strong jaw, eyes that held intelligence and something else, desperation, perhaps, or the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from traveling too far with too little rest. This was not the face of a raider or a threat, but of a father trying to protect his child. The knocking came again, more urgent this time, followed by a voice that carried clearly despite the storm's noise. "Please, ma'am, my boy is sick. We just need a place to wait out the rain." Emma stood frozen behind her shutters, her hand pressed unconsciously to her swollen belly, feeling the weight of decision settle over her like a physical burden. Every rational thought told her to remain silent, to wait until the strangers moved on, to prioritize her own safety and that of her unborn child above all other considerations. But the voice that had called through her door carried no threat, only exhaustion and a father's concern for his sick child. Emma had been a teacher long enough to recognize the particular desperation that came when a parent faced their child's suffering and found themselves powerless to provide relief. She'd seen it in the faces of mothers whose children struggled with lessons, fathers who couldn't afford proper shoes for the winter months. The rational voice in her head recited all the reasons why opening her door would be foolish beyond measure. She was alone, pregnant, vulnerable in every way that mattered. These were Indians, and while she'd never personally experienced violence at native hands, the stories were everywhere, whispered in sewing circles and shouted from newspaper headlines. The Colorado Territory was still technically at war with several tribal groups, and harboring enemy combatants could bring federal troops down on her head. But another voice, quieter and deeper, reminded Emma of the values Jacob had loved most about her. Her willingness to see people as individuals, rather than as representatives of their race or class. Her instinct to help first and ask questions later. The way she'd always opened their home to travelers, whether they were fellow settlers heading west or circuit preachers making their rounds. Lightning crashed again, closer this time, and in its brief illumination, Emma could see that the child was no longer standing. The boy had collapsed against his father's legs, and the man was struggling to hold him upright while maintaining his own balance on the rain-slicked porch. Whatever illness had struck the child was serious enough that his father had risked approaching a stranger's home in the middle of a dangerous storm. Emma made her decision in that instant, moving away from the window with as much speed as her pregnancy allowed. She lifted the heavy wooden bar that secured her door and pulled it open, just wide enough to peer out at her unexpected visitors. The man who stood on her porch was younger than she'd expected, probably no more than 30, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of a life spent outdoors. His long black hair was braided with leather strips and small bone ornaments that marked his tribal affiliation, though Emma couldn't identify which specific group he belonged to. His clothing was a mixture of traditional native dress and practical frontier gear buckskin leggings, a cotton shirt that had seen better days, and a leather vest decorated with intricate beadwork. But it was his eyes that convinced Emma she'd made the right choice. Dark brown, intelligent, and filled with the kind of quiet dignity that couldn't be faked or manufactured. These were the eyes of a man who'd asked for help because he had no other choice, not because he intended harm. "My name is Mike," he said simply, his English carrying only the faintest trace of an accent. "This is my son, Running Fox. He has the fever, and we've been traveling for 3 days without proper shelter. I can pay for food and a place by your fire." Emma looked down at the child and felt her heart clench with sympathy. The boy was indeed burning with fever, his small face flushed and his breathing shallow and rapid. His eyes were closed, but she could see the rapid movement beneath his lids that suggested delirium. "Bring him inside," Emma said, stepping back to make room. "Quickly, before you both catch your death." Mike carried his son across Emma's threshold with the careful movements of someone who'd been bearing that precious burden for far too long. The boy's head lolled against his father's shoulder, and Emma could hear the congestion in his breathing, even from across the small room. Emma's cabin was modest but clean, its single room divided into functional areas by careful arrangement of furniture rather than walls. Her bed occupied one corner, with Jacob's old trunk serving as a knitstand. The kitchen area centered around a cast-iron stove that Jacob had hauled all the way from Kansas, and a rough wooden table where Emma took her meals and did her mending. A pair of ladder-back chairs completed the seating, along with a rocking chair that Jacob had been carving for the baby before his death. "Put him in the rocking chair," Emma directed, moving to stoke the fire in her stove. "It's the warmest spot in the room, and he'll be comfortable there while I heat some water." Mike settled his son carefully into the chair, then stood back with the awkward uncertainty of someone unaccustomed to accepting help from strangers. Water dripped steadily from his soaked clothing onto Emma's plank floor, and she could see him trying to minimize the mess, even as his own exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. "Your clothes," Emma said practically. "You'll both catch pneumonia if you stay in those wet things. I have some of my husband's clothes that might fit you, and I can find something for the boy." Mike's eyes found the simple wooden cross that hung above Emma's bed, then moved to the framed daguerreotype of her and Jacob on their wedding day. Understanding passed across his features, followed by something that might have been sympathy. "Your husband?" he asked quietly. "Died last spring," Emma replied, surprised by how easily the words came. "Fever, like your boy has now. I know what you're going through." She moved to Jacob's trunk and began pulling out clothes, holding up a shirt against Mike's shoulders to judge the fit. He was taller than Jacob had been, broader through the chest, but the clothes would serve well enough until his own dried out. "I don't want to impose," Mike said, but Emma could hear the exhaustion in his voice. The way a man sounds when he's been strong for too long and finally finds himself in a place where strength might not be required. "It's not an imposition," Emma replied firmly. "It's what neighbors do for each other. Now change into these dry clothes while I tend to your son. There's a blanket you can hang behind if you need privacy." Mike accepted the clothes with a nod of gratitude that seemed to come from deeper than mere politeness. Emma busied herself with preparations for treating the sick child, filling her largest pot with water and setting it on the stove to heat. She had some willow bark tea that might help with the fever, and a jar of honey that could soothe the boy's throat. As she worked, Emma found herself glancing sideways at her unexpected guests. Mike moved with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in his own body, but there was something else in his bearing that she couldn't quite identify. An education, perhaps, or the kind of natural authority that marked leaders rather than followers. The boy, running fox, stirred restlessly in the rocking chair, muttering words in what Emma assumed was his native language. His fever-bright eyes opened briefly, fixing on Emma with the kind of intense focus that sick children sometimes displayed, as if trying to understand where they were and whether they were safe. "It's all right," Emma murmured, moving closer to place a gentle hand on the child's forehead. His skin burned with fever, but not the dangerous dry heat that had marked Jacob's final illness. This was the kind of fever that might break with proper care and rest. "You're safe now, both of you." While Mike changed into Jacob's dry clothes behind the hanging blanket, Emma prepared her simple remedies with the efficient movements of someone who'd learned medicine from necessity rather than formal training. She'd nursed Jacob through his final illness, and before that, she'd cared for her own parents during the cholera outbreak that had claimed so many lives in their Kansas town. The willow bark tea steeped in a chipped china cup that had been her grandmother's, filling the cabin with an herbal scent that seemed to cut through the dampness the storm had brought indoors. Emma tested the temperature carefully, then approached running fox with the kind of gentle authority she'd once used to coax reluctant students through difficult lessons. "Can you drink this for me?" she asked the boy, crouching beside the rocking chair despite the way the position made her back ache. It will help with the fever. Running Fox's eyes opened fully for the first time since entering the cabin, and Emma found herself looking into dark brown depths that reminded her strongly of his father's gaze. Intelligence flickered there, along with the natural wariness of a child who'd learned that not all adults could be trusted. "It's medicine," Emma explained patiently. "Like what your grandmother might give you, but made from different plants. White willow instead of whatever your people use for fever." The boy's eyes shifted past Emma to where his father was emerging from behind the blanket, transformed by dry clothes and the warmth of the cabin. Jacob's clothes hung a bit loose on Mike's frame, but they served their purpose, and Emma noticed how much younger he looked without the weight of rain-soaked garments dragging at his shoulders. Mike said something in their native language, his voice carrying the gentle authority of a father encouraging his child to cooperate with necessary but unpleasant medicine. Running Fox nodded slowly and accepted the cup, sipping the bitter tea with the stoic patience that seemed to be bred into children who'd grown up understanding that comfort was sometimes a luxury they couldn't afford. "You speak English very well," Emma observed as Mike settled into the other chair at her small table. "Better than most of the settlers who come through here, actually." Something flickered across Mike's features, too quick for Emma to interpret, but his response came easily enough. "I spent time at the mission school when I was younger. The priests insisted we learn proper English if we wanted to eat their food." Emma nodded, understanding more than Mike might have expected. She'd heard about the mission schools, the government's attempts to civilize Indian children by removing them from their families and forcing them to abandon their native languages and customs. The policy struck her as unnecessarily cruel, but she also recognized that men like Mike had probably found ways to use that enforced education to their advantage. "Running Fox is a beautiful name," she said, settling carefully into her own chair and unconsciously rubbing her swollen belly as the baby shifted restlessly. "Does it have a special meaning?" "He could run before he could walk properly," Mike replied, and for the first time since arriving, Emma caught a glimpse of paternal pride breaking through his careful reserve. Even as a baby, he was always trying to chase after the older children, always moving, always exploring. The name seemed to fit. Emma smiled at the image, remembering her own students who'd possessed that same restless energy, the ones who'd fidgeted through arithmetic lessons and gazed longingly out the schoolhouse windows during grammar recitations. "I was a teacher before coming here. Children like that were my favorites, the ones who saw learning as just another kind of adventure." Mike's eyebrows rose with genuine interest. "A teacher? That explains the books." He gestured toward the small shelf where Emma kept her precious collection of literature and reference texts, volumes that had survived the journey from Kansas and represented her connection to the educated world she'd left behind. "What do you teach your son?" Emma asked, genuinely curious about how education worked in Mike's world. "I mean, aside from the practical things like hunting and tracking, stories mostly," Mike replied, settling back in his chair as Running Fox's breathing began to even out with the first effects of the willow bark tea. "The history of our people, the meanings behind our ceremonies, the relationships between all living things. And mathematics. Actually, we use mathematics for trade, for understanding the movements of the stars, for calculating distances and travel times." Emma felt a spark of professional interest. "You know mathematics?" "Enough to get by," Mike said with what Emma was beginning to recognize as characteristic modesty. "Addition, subtraction, some basic geometry." The mission school teachers were quite thorough. As they talked, Emma found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't experienced since Jacob's death. There was something deeply comforting about having adult conversation again, about sharing her space with people who appreciated the warmth and shelter she could provide. Running Fox had fallen into what appeared to be genuine sleep rather than fever-induced unconsciousness, and his breathing was already less labored. The storm outside seemed to be intensifying, with wind howling around the cabin's corners and rain drumming against the shuttered windows with increased violence. Emma realized that even if she'd wanted to send her guests back into the night, doing so would probably amount to a death sentence for the sick child. "You'll stay the night," she said, making the decision aloud. "Both of you. The storm's getting worse, and your son needs rest and warmth to recover properly." Mike's gratitude was evident in his expression, but Emma also caught something else, relief so profound it suggested he'd been more worried about his son's condition than he'd allowed himself to show. "Thank you," he said simply. "I know this isn't easy for you, taking in strangers. Jacob always said that hospitality was the highest virtue." Emma replied, surprising herself with how easily she could speak her dead husband's name in front of these strangers. He would have done the same thing. As the evening progressed, Emma prepared the simple meal she could manage with her limited supplies: beans seasoned with the last of her salt pork, cornbread made from the bottom scrapings of her flour barrel, and coffee brewed from grounds she'd been saving for a special occasion that had never seemed to arrive. Mike insisted on helping despite Emma's protests, moving around her small kitchen with surprising competence as he stirred the beans and kept the coffee from boiling over. His presence filled the cabin in a way that felt natural rather than intrusive, and Emma found herself remembering what it had been like to share domestic tasks with another adult. "Your son is feeling better," Emma observed, watching Running Fox examined the carved wooden animals that had been Jacob's hobby during the long winter evenings. The boy's fever had broken while they cooked, leaving him weak but alert, interested in his surroundings for the first time since arriving. "Children recover quickly when they feel safe," Mike replied, ladling beans into the chipped bowls Emma had set out. "He was more frightened than sick, I think. We've been traveling for a long time, and he's not used to sleeping in unfamiliar places." Emma settled carefully into her chair, accepting the bowl Mike offered with a nod of thanks. The beans smelled better than anything she'd eaten in weeks, probably because she hadn't been forced to prepare them alone. "Where are you traveling to, if you don't mind my asking?" Mike hesitated, and Emma caught that same flicker of something caution, perhaps, or the automatic wariness of someone who'd learned that too much honesty could be dangerous. "South," he said finally, "toward the reservations in New Mexico territory. We have family there." The answer felt incomplete, but Emma didn't press. She'd learned during her teaching years that people revealed their truths in their own time, and pushing usually resulted in greater secrecy rather than greater openness. "It's dangerous country between here and there," she said instead, "especially traveling alone with a child. Less dangerous than staying where we were." Mike replied, and this time Emma heard something in his voice that suggested their journey wasn't entirely voluntary. Exile, perhaps, or flight from some situation that had made remaining in their original home impossible. They ate in companionable silence, the storm providing a dramatic soundtrack that made the cabin's warmth feel even more precious by contrast. Running Fox managed half a bowl of beans and a piece of cornbread, enough to satisfy his father that the worst of the illness had passed. "Ma'am," the boy said suddenly, his voice still hoarse from fever but clear enough to understand. "Why do you live here alone, Running Fox?" Mike said sharply. But Emma held up a hand to indicate the question didn't offend her. "My husband died," she explained gently, using the same matter-of-fact tone she'd once employed to explain difficult concepts to her students. "Now it's just me and the baby." She patted her swollen belly, smiling as the child inside responded with a vigorous kick. Running Fox's eyes widened with interest. "There's a baby in there, there is. He or she will be born in about 2 months." Emma found herself enjoying the boy's curiosity, his obvious fascination with the mystery of new life. "Will you teach the baby like you taught other children?" Running Fox asked, and Emma felt her heart squeeze with the sweetness of the question. "I hope so," she replied. "I hope I'll be able to teach my child many things." Mike was watching this exchange with an expression Emma couldn't quite read. But she sensed approval in his attention, perhaps even admiration for the way she'd handled his son's innocent, but potentially painful questions. As the evening wound down, Emma prepared sleeping arrangements with the practical efficiency that pregnancy had taught her to value. Running Fox could sleep in her bed while she took the rocking chair, and Mike could make do with blankets on the floor near the stove. "I can't take your bed," Mike protested, but Emma was firm in her decision. "You can and you will," she replied. "Your son needs proper rest to finish recovering, and I'm used to sleeping in the chair. The baby keeps me awake anyway, kicking at all hours." As they settled in for the night, Emma found herself feeling more content than she had since Jacob's death. The cabin felt alive again, filled with the sounds of breathing and the small movements that marked the presence of other human beings. For the first time in months, she wouldn't be falling asleep to the lonely sound of wind and rain against empty walls. But as she dozed in the rocking chair, one hand resting on her belly and the other clutching the shawl Jacob had bought her for their last anniversary together, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Mike's story than he'd revealed. Something about his education, his bearing, the careful way he chose his words, suggested a background more complex than he'd admitted. Still, as sleep finally claimed her, Emma found herself grateful for whatever circumstances had brought this mysterious father and son to her door. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and decisions, but tonight, none of them had to face the storm alone. Emma woke to the unfamiliar sound of splitting wood and the rich aroma of coffee brewing stronger than she'd tasted in months. Pale morning light filtered through her shuttered windows, revealing that the storm had finally exhausted itself during the night, leaving behind the crystalline silence that follows nature's fury. Her back ached from sleeping in the rocking chair, and the baby was already active, pressing against her ribs with what felt like tiny fists demanding attention. She found Mike outside her cabin, methodically splitting logs from the woodpile that Jacob had cut, but never had the chance to finish preparing. He'd stripped down to just his cotton shirt, despite the morning chill, and Emma could see the play of muscles across his shoulders as he brought the axe down with perfect precision. Each strike split the wood cleanly, no wasted motion, no second blows needed. What struck Emma most wasn't his physical competence, which she'd expected from any man who'd survived life on the frontier, but the systematic way he'd organized the work. The split wood was stacked according to size, with kindling separated from larger pieces, everything arranged for maximum efficiency. This wasn't the random chopping of someone killing time, but the methodical approach of someone who understood the principles of organization and planning. "You didn't have to do that," Emma called from her doorway, wrapping Jacob's old coat around her shoulders against the morning air. "I could have managed the wood myself." Mike paused in his work, wiping sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. In the clear morning light, Emma could see him more distinctly than she had by candlelight. His features were indeed Native American, but there was something else in his bone structure, a refinement that spoke of mixed heritage. His skin was darker than most whites, but not as dark as full-blood Indians she'd encountered, and his hair, while traditionally long, was clean and well-maintained in a way that suggested regular access to soap and proper grooming supplies. "A man pays his debts," Mike replied simply, but Emma caught the underlying formality in his speech pattern. Not the broken English she expected from someone educated at a mission school, but the careful diction of someone who'd learned to speak properly through extensive practice and correction. "You provided shelter and medicine for my son. Wood for your stove is small payment for such kindness." Emma stepped outside, noting how Mike had also repaired the loose board on her porch steps and cleared the rain gutters that had been clogged with autumn leaves for weeks. "Where did you learn to do all this?" "The carpentry work, I mean." Another of those brief hesitations that Emma was beginning to recognize as Mike's response to questions that probed too deeply into his background. "A man learns what he needs to survive," he said, deflecting rather than answering directly. Your husband built well, but maintenance requires constant attention. Inside the cabin, Emma discovered that Mike had not only made coffee, but had somehow produced eggs, bacon, and fresh bread that definitely hadn't come from her nearly empty larder. Running Fox sat at her small table, looking remarkably recovered from his fever, carefully arranging wooden animals that Emma recognized as far more sophisticated than the simple toys Jacob had carved. Where did all this food come from? Emma asked, accepting a cup of coffee that was so perfectly brewed it might have come from the finest hotel in Denver, rather than her battered tin pot. I had supplies in my pack, Mike replied, but Emma noticed he didn't meet her eyes while saying it. Traveling rations. I thought you might enjoy something more substantial than beans for breakfast. Emma examined the eggs more closely. They were fresh, still slightly warm, not the kind of preserved provisions that travelers typically carried. The bacon was thick-cut and expertly cured, and the bread was still soft, baked within the last day or two. These weren't trail supplies, but luxury items that would have cost a fortune at Morrison's General Store. These eggs are fresh, Emma said carefully, testing to see how Mike would respond to gentle questioning. And this bread was baked yesterday at most. Running Fox looked up from his wooden animals, his young face bright with recovered health and natural curiosity. Father traded with the merchant wagon yesterday before the storm got bad. He gave them silver for good food, because he said we might meet someone who needed sharing. Mike's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, and he said something sharp in their native language that made Running Fox duck his head apologetically. But the damage was done. Emma now understood that Mike had possessed quality food and had chosen to share it with her, but more importantly, that he had silver to trade with merchant wagons. Real silver, not the scrip or barter goods that most travelers used in the Colorado territory. You have silver, Emma said, not quite making it a question but clearly inviting explanation. Some, Mike admitted reluctantly. Enough to pay for hospitality and to see us safely to New Mexico territory. Emma felt a flutter of unease that had nothing to do with the baby's movements. Silver was rare on the frontier, possessed mainly by successful businessmen, government officials, or those engaged in activities that generated substantial profits. The kind of silver that could purchase fresh food from merchant wagons wasn't the modest savings of a displaced Indian seeking refuge with distant relatives. But as she watched Mike help Running Fox cut his bacon into manageable pieces, speaking to the boy in gentle tones that mixed English with their native language, Emma found her suspicions tempered by the obvious genuineness of his paternal care. Whatever secrets Mike might be hiding, his love for his son was transparent and deeply moving. The wooden animals, Emma said, changing the subject to safer ground. Did you carve those yourself? Mike's face relaxed slightly as he nodded toward his son's toys. Winter project last year. Running Fox was fascinated by all the different creatures we'd seen in our travels, and I thought he should have a way to remember them. Emma picked up one of the figures, a bear carved with such intricate detail that she could see individual strands of fur texture in the wood. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, requiring not just skill but formal training in woodworking techniques. This wasn't whittling but genuine artistry. This is beautiful work, she said honestly. You could sell pieces like this in Denver for serious money. They're not for selling, Mike replied with quiet firmness. They're family. Running Fox's history, carved so he'll remember where he comes from, no matter where life takes him. After breakfast, Emma discovered that Mike's competence extended far beyond woodcutting and carpentry. When she mentioned that her cow had gone dry, he examined Bessie with the practiced eye of someone who understood animal husbandry, quickly diagnosing a mineral deficiency that could be corrected with proper feed supplements. She needs more green forage and salt, Mike explained, running gentle hands along Bessie's flanks in a way that immediately calmed the nervous animal. The constant rain has leached nutrients from the grass, and she's not getting what she needs to maintain milk production. A few weeks of proper feeding should restore her. Emma stared at him in amazement. How do you know about cattle health? Most Indians I've met are horsemen, not dairy farmers. Mike's smile carried a hint of something Emma couldn't quite identify: amusement, perhaps, or irony. I've had occasion to learn about many things. Survival requires adaptability. When Emma showed him her struggling vegetable garden, Mike diagnosed problems with soil drainage and crop rotation that would have impressed an agricultural college professor. When her pump handle broke while they were drawing water for Bessie, Mike repaired it using techniques that spoke of formal mechanical training. When Running Fox asked about the mathematics behind calculating planting schedules, Mike's explanation demonstrated understanding of complex agricultural economics. You're not a typical Indian, Emma said finally, watching Mike demonstrate to Running Fox how to calculate the optimal spacing for winter wheat planting. Your education goes far beyond mission school basics this time. Mike's hesitation lasted long enough to become uncomfortable. Education takes many forms, he said carefully. Sometimes we learn from books, sometimes from experience, sometimes from people who know more than we do. But Emma had been a teacher too long to miss the signs of someone deflecting difficult questions. Mike's knowledge wasn't the accumulated wisdom of experience, but the systematic understanding of formal education. His explanations followed logical progression, used technical terminology correctly, and demonstrated the kind of broad-based learning that came from years of structured study. Where did you really go to school? Emma asked directly, tired of dancing around the obvious questions. Mike was quiet for so long that Emma thought he might not answer at all. Finally he said, Carlisle Industrial School in Pennsylvania. 5 years, starting when I was 12. Emma felt her breath catch. Carlisle was famous throughout the country as the government's flagship institution for civilizing Indian children. But it was also notoriously selective, accepting only the brightest students from the most prominent tribal families. The education provided there was equivalent to the finest Eastern preparatory schools, designed to produce Native American leaders who could bridge the gap between their traditional cultures and white American society. Carlisle doesn't accept just anyone, Emma said quietly. They only take children from important families, chiefs' sons, future tribal leaders. Mike's expression closed off completely, and Emma realized she'd pushed too hard, asked questions that touched on whatever secrets had driven him to travel incognito through the Colorado Territory with his young son. My father believed education was the key to our people's survival, Mike said finally. He was wrong about many things, but he was right about that. The world is changing, and those who can't adapt to change don't survive. Later that morning, while Mike worked on reinforcing Emma's chicken coop against future fox raids, Emma made a discovery that deepened her growing certainty that her mysterious guest was far more than he appeared. She'd been organizing her teaching materials, preparing lessons for the few children in Broken Creek whose parents wanted extra tutoring, when Running Fox approached with shy curiosity. Ma'am, what are those? The boy asked, pointing to the Latin textbooks Emma had brought from Kansas. Books for teaching Latin, Emma explained. It's an old language that helps people understand English better, and it's used in medicine and law. To her amazement, Running Fox's face lit up with recognition. Father knows that language. He reads from books like that sometimes, and he taught me some of the words. Emma looked up sharply to find Mike frozen in his work on the chicken coop, obviously having overheard his son's revelation. You read Latin? She called across the yard. Mike straightened slowly, resignation clear in his posture. Some, he admitted. Carlisle required it for students in the advanced program. Emma walked over to him, carrying one of her Latin texts. Would you mind translating this passage for me? I've been struggling with it for weeks. Mike accepted the book with obvious reluctance, but when his eyes found the page Emma indicated, his expression changed to one of genuine interest. It's from Virgil's Aeneid, he said, reading the Latin with perfect pronunciation. This section deals with Aeneas's arrival in Italy and his negotiations with the local king. The translation would be something like, "Fortune favors the bold, but wisdom guides the fortunate to lasting success." Emma felt her knees go weak. Mike hadn't just translated the passage accurately, but had provided context and interpretation. That demonstrated deep familiarity with classical literature. This wasn't the basic Latin taught at frontier mission schools, but the sophisticated understanding that came from years of advanced study. "Who are you really?" Emma asked quietly, aware that Running Fox was listening but needing answers to the questions that were multiplying faster than she could process them. Mike closed the book carefully and handed it back to her. "I'm someone who's learned that education without wisdom can be dangerous, and that sometimes the most important lessons can't be found in any book." Before Emma could press for more specific answers, Running Fox tugged at his father's shirt. "Father, should I tell her about the letters you write? The ones to important men in the territorial government?" Mike's face went completely pale, and he spoke sharply to his son in their native language. But Emma had heard enough to understand that Mike's connections to the territorial government were more substantial than he'd implied. "You correspond with government officials?" Emma asked, trying to keep her voice calm despite the growing certainty that she'd stumbled into something far more complex than a simple case of frontier hospitality. "It's not what you think," Mike said quickly. But Emma could see the desperation in his eyes, the look of someone whose carefully constructed facade was crumbling beyond repair. "Then tell me what it is," Emma replied firmly. "Because right now I'm thinking that either you're a government spy pretending to be a displaced Indian, or you're someone important enough that territorial officials want to stay in communication with you. Either way, I think I deserve to know. Who's been sleeping under my roof?" Mike looked at his son, then back at Emma, clearly wrestling with how much truth he could safely reveal. Finally, he sank down onto the steps of Emma's cabin, suddenly looking older and more tired than his years. "My father was a chief," he said slowly. "Not just any chief, but one who believed that our people's survival depended on learning to work within the white man's system rather than fighting against it. He sent me to Carlisle, not just for education, but to learn how to be a bridge between our worlds." Emma settled carefully beside him, her pregnancy making graceful movement impossible, but her curiosity overriding physical discomfort. "What happened? Why aren't you serving as that bridge now?" "Because bridges get stepped on by people traveling in both directions," Mike replied with bitter humor. "My father's people thought I'd become too white, and the white authorities thought I was too Indian. When tensions rose along the territorial borders, both sides decided I was a liability rather than an asset." Running Fox had moved closer during this conversation, and Emma could see in the boy's face that he'd heard variations of this story before. This wasn't a new revelation, but a familiar pain that father and son carried together. "So you're traveling to New Mexico territory to escape political pressure?" Emma asked, trying to piece together the fragments of information Mike was providing. "Among other things," Mike admitted. "The territorial governor's office has been pressuring me to use my influence with various tribal groups to support policies that I believe would be harmful to my people. When I refused to cooperate, they made it clear that my continued presence in Colorado might become problematic." Emma felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "They threatened you?" "Not directly. But they also made it clear that my son's safety couldn't be guaranteed if I continued to oppose their initiatives. When a man threatens your child, even indirectly, it's time to find a new place to make your stand." The pieces were beginning to form a picture that both explained Mike's sophistication and deepened Emma's concern for both father and son. If Mike was indeed the son of an important chief, educated at Carlisle, and politically prominent enough to draw pressure from territorial officials, then his presence in her cabin represented a level of risk she hadn't considered. "Are they looking for you?" Emma asked quietly. "Are you in danger right now?" "I don't think so," Mike replied, but Emma caught the uncertainty in his voice. "We've been careful to avoid main roads and established settlements. Broken Creek was supposed to be just a place to wait out the storm before continuing south." Emma studied Mike's profile as he gazed across her small homestead toward the mountains that marked the horizon. Everything about him suggested a man carrying burdens far heavier than those typically associated with simple displacement or economic hardship. This was someone who'd been forced to choose between his principles and his safety, who'd chosen exile rather than compromise. "The letters Running Fox mentioned," Emma said carefully. "Are you still in communication with territorial officials?" Mike's smile was grim. "I write to them occasionally, letting them know that I'm still alive and still unwilling to support their policies. It seems important to make clear that my absence is temporary, not permanent. Someday, when the political climate changes, I may be able to return and resume the work my father trained me to do." Emma felt a flutter of admiration for Mike's courage, even as she recognized the danger his presence might bring to her own doorstep. He was a man who'd refused to abandon his principles, even when doing so would have been far safer and more comfortable. "But for now, you're just a traveler seeking safe passage to New Mexico territory?" Emma asked. "For now," Mike agreed. "Though I suspect that after this conversation, you understand why I was careful about revealing too much too quickly. Not everyone would be comfortable providing shelter to someone with my particular complications." As the morning progressed into afternoon, Emma found herself seeing Mike and Running Fox through entirely new eyes. What she'd initially interpreted as natural competence now revealed itself as the kind of comprehensive education that prepared men for leadership roles. Mike's knowledge of agriculture, animal husbandry, mechanics, and classical literature wasn't the random accumulation of survival skills, but the systematic preparation of someone intended to serve as a cultural ambassador. She watched him teach Running Fox to calculate lumber requirements for cabin construction, explaining the mathematical principles, while simultaneously providing practical experience in measurement and planning. This wasn't a father passing on traditional skills, but an educator ensuring that his son would be prepared for whatever future awaited them. "You're still teaching," Emma observed, settling into her rocking chair on the porch where she could watch the lesson while resting her aching back. "Even in exile, you're preparing your son for leadership." Mike looked up from the lumber calculations, his expression thoughtful. "Leadership isn't about position or authority," he said. "It's about understanding how to solve problems and help others solve theirs. Those skills are valuable regardless of where life takes us." Emma felt a familiar warmth in her chest, the same satisfaction she'd experienced during her best days in the classroom when she'd managed to connect, learning to life in ways that made education feel vital rather than abstract. "That's exactly what I used to tell my students. Knowledge isn't about memorizing facts, but about developing the ability to think clearly and act wisely." "You would have made an excellent teacher at Carlisle," Mike said with what appeared to be genuine admiration. The best instructors there understood that education was about developing character as much as intellect. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Emma realized that she was facing a decision she hadn't anticipated when she'd opened her door to strangers the night before. Mike and Running Fox were clearly more than simple travelers, and their continued presence in her cabin might draw attention she wasn't equipped to handle. But they were also refugees from political persecution, a father and son who'd sacrificed comfort and security rather than compromise their principles. "How long were you planning to stay in the area?" Emma asked, trying to sound casual despite the weight of the question. "We should probably move on tomorrow," Mike replied, though Emma thought she detected reluctance in his voice. "The storm has passed, and the longer we remain in one place, the greater the risk that someone will take notice of us." Emma felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. In less than 24 hours, Mike and Running Fox had transformed her lonely cabin into something that felt like a home again. The thought of returning to solitary meals and silent evenings held far less appeal than it had just yesterday. "You're welcome to stay longer if you need to," she heard herself saying. "I mean, if Running Fox needs more time to recover completely. Or if you want to wait for better traveling weather." Mike's grateful smile suggested that her offer was more welcome than he'd expected. "That's generous of you, especially considering the risks. Are you certain you're comfortable with the potential complications?" Emma looked at Running Fox, who was carefully stacking the lumber scraps they'd used for their mathematics lesson. And then at Mike, whose combination of strength and gentleness reminded her poignantly of Jacob's best qualities. Whatever complications their presence might bring, the alternative, returning to the crushing loneliness that had defined her life since Jacob's death, seemed far worse. "I'm certain," she said firmly. "Besides, I suspect that having a man around the place, even temporarily, might actually reduce certain kinds of trouble rather than increase them." And as the first day of their extended stay drew to a close, Emma found herself feeling more hopeful about the future than she had since Jacob's death. Whatever secrets Mike might still be hiding, whatever dangers their presence might eventually bring, she was no longer facing her pregnancy and the approaching birth of her child entirely alone. 3 days after the storm, Emma was hanging laundry behind her cabin when the sound of approaching horses made her blood turn cold. Not the casual clip-clop of a single rider or the familiar rumble of a supply wagon, but the synchronized thunder of multiple horses moving at military pace. She dropped the wet sheet she'd been pinning to the line and moved quickly to the corner of the cabin where she could observe the approaching riders without being easily seen. 6 men on horseback crested the small hill that separated her homestead from the main road to Broken Creek. Even at a distance, their formation and bearing marked them as official rather than casual travelers. They wore the dusty blue uniforms of territorial marshals, with sidearms prominently displayed and rifles secured to their saddles in the ready position. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized that Mike's fears about being pursued had been well-founded. She pressed herself against the cabin's log wall, trying to think clearly despite the panic that threatened to overwhelm her rational thoughts. Mike and Running Fox were inside, Mike helping her repair a broken chair while his son practiced writing English letters on precious paper. The lead rider, a man with sergeant's stripes and a face weathered by years of frontier service, raised his hand to signal a halt just outside Emma's property line. His eyes swept methodically across her small homestead, taking in the repaired porch, the organized woodpile, the general air of recent maintenance that Mike's presence had brought to the place. "Mrs. Hartwell," the sergeant called, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "We need to speak with you about some travelers who might have passed through this area recently." Emma forced herself to step away from the cabin wall, smoothing her apron with hands that trembled only slightly. Years of teaching had given her experience in maintaining composure under pressure, and she drew on that training now as she approached the mounted men with what she hoped appeared to be innocent curiosity. "Sergeant," she replied, nodding politely while keeping her voice steady. "What kind of travelers are you looking for? We don't see many people out this way, especially after the storm we just had." The sergeant dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent more time in the saddle than on the ground, and Emma noticed that his hand remained near his sidearm even during this seemingly casual conversation. Indian man, probably traveling with a child. Might have been seeking shelter during the weather. Goes by the name of Mike or Michael, speaks educated English. Emma felt her mouth go dry, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact with the sergeant while her mind raced through possible responses. Lying to territorial marshals was a serious offense that could result in arrest and imprisonment, but revealing Mike's presence would almost certainly result in his capture and whatever consequences had driven him to flee in the first place. "An, Indian man?" Emma repeated, buying time while she tried to formulate a response that would protect Mike without technically constituting perjury. What's he wanted for, if you don't mind my asking? Official business. The sergeant replied curtly, his tone making clear that civilian curiosity wasn't welcome. The territorial governor's office has issued orders for his immediate apprehension. He's wanted for questioning regarding his role in recent incidents along the reservation boundaries. Emma's blood chilled at the mention of the territorial governor. Mike had mentioned pressure from that office, but she'd assumed he was referring to political disagreements rather than criminal charges. If the governor had issued official arrest orders, Mike's situation was far more serious than he'd revealed. Well, I certainly haven't seen anyone matching that description, Emma said carefully, choosing her words with the precision she'd once used to explain complex grammatical concepts to her students. The storm kept me inside mostly, and I don't get many visitors out here under the best of circumstances. One of the other marshals, a younger man with the eager intensity of someone new to his authority, urged his horse closer to the cabin. Ma'am, we have reports that someone matching this Indian's description was seen in the area just before the storm hit. Merchant wagon driver said he saw a man and boy seeking shelter, maybe trading for supplies. Emma's heart sank as she realized that Mike's transaction with the merchant wagon had indeed been noticed and reported. The careful precautions he'd taken to avoid detection had been undermined by his decision to purchase quality food for their shared meals. I'm sure I don't know anything about that, Emma replied, technically truthful since she hadn't known about Mike's trading activities until Running Fox had mentioned them. Like I said, the storm kept everyone inside. Hard to say what travelers might have been in the area. The sergeant studied Emma's face with the practiced eye of someone trained to detect deception. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm going to ask you one more time, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Have you seen or had contact with any Indian individuals in the past week? Emma opened her mouth to repeat her denial, but before she could speak, the cabin door opened and Mike stepped outside. He moved with calm deliberation, his hands visible and empty, but Emma could see the tension in his shoulders that spoke of a man prepared for violence if necessary. Sergeant Peterson, Mike said quietly, his voice carrying a note of weary resignation. I wondered when you'd catch up with us. The effect of Mike's appearance on the mounted marshals was immediate and electric. Hands moved to weapon grips, horses shifted restlessly as their riders tensed for action, and the sergeant's face hardened into the expression of a man who'd finally cornered his quarry. Michael Nighthawk, Sergeant Peterson said, his voice carrying satisfaction and something else, recognition that went beyond mere professional duty. Or should I say, Michael Thornton? It's been a long time since anyone's seen hide or hair of the governor's missing stepson. Emma felt the world tilt around her as the implications of Peterson's words crashed over her like cold water. Michael Thornton, the territorial governor's stepson who disappeared 15 years ago and been presumed dead. The boy who'd been taken by Comanche raiders during an attack on a military supply convoy and never seen again. Mike's jaw tightened, but he showed no surprise at the sergeant's revelation. I go by the name my adopted father gave me now. Michael Nighthawk died when he chose his people over the whites who bore him. Your people, Peterson said with contempt, dismounting fully now and signaling his men to spread out in a loose circle around the cabin. You mean the savages who murdered your mother and kidnapped you when you were just a boy? Funny how you've chosen to identify with your captors, rather than the family that mourned you for dead. Emma watched Mike's face transform as Peterson spoke, seeing for the first time the controlled fury that he'd kept carefully hidden during their days together. This wasn't the gentleman who'd taught Running Fox mathematics or helped repair her chicken coop, but someone capable of violence when pushed beyond his limits. My mother died in that raid, Mike said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. But so did the boy who might have grown up to be another white man stealing Indian land and calling it progress. The Comanche who found me gave me a life worth living, a father worth respecting, and a purpose worth fighting for. they gave. You Stockholm Syndrome and a savage's education, Peterson snapped back. But blood tells, boy. You're still Governor Thornton's stepson. Still a white man, no matter how many feathers you stick in your hair, or how many heathen customs you adopt. Emma saw Mike's hands clench into fists and realized that violence was only moments away. Whatever history existed between Mike and Sergeant Peterson, it went deeper than simple law enforcement and involved personal animosity that threatened to explode into bloodshed. Sergeant, Emma said quickly, stepping between the two men despite her pregnancy making such movement awkward and potentially dangerous. There's no need for hostility here. If you have official business with Mr. Nighthawk, surely it can be conducted civilly. Peterson's attention snapped to Emma with laser focus. Mrs. Hartwell, you've been harboring a fugitive from territorial justice. That's a serious crime that could result in your arrest and imprisonment. I suggest you step aside and let us do our job. Emma felt the weight of decision pressing down on her like a physical burden. Everything she'd built since Jacob's death, her small measure of independence, her plans for raising her child in the Colorado Territory, her fragile financial stability, could be destroyed by the choice she made in the next few moments. But as she looked at Mike's face, seeing the resignation there alongside the controlled anger, Emma realized that her decision had already been made. This was the man who'd chopped her wood without being asked, who'd fixed her roof and taught her sons mathematics, who'd shared his food and treated her with respect despite her reduced circumstances. I don't know anything about fugitives or territorial justice, Emma said firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. I know that this man and his son sought shelter during a dangerous storm, and I provided it because it was the Christian thing to do. If that makes me a criminal in the eyes of the territorial government, then I suppose I'll have to live with the consequences. Peterson's face darkened with anger. Mrs. Hartwell, I strongly advise you to reconsider your position. Governor Thornton has been searching for his stepson for 15 years. This is a family matter as much as a legal one. Governor Thornton lost his stepson when Comanche raiders killed his mother and took the boy. Mike said quietly, what stands before you now is a Comanche warrior who was raised by Chief Running Bear and educated to serve as a bridge between our peoples. Michael Thornton is dead, Sergeant. He died the day he chose to stay with the people who gave him a life worth living. Emma could see the pain beneath Mike's defiant words, the complex grief of someone who'd been forced to choose between two identities and could never fully belong to either world. The boy who'd been taken from his white family had indeed died, but so had the Comanche warrior who'd tried to serve both peoples. You can call yourself whatever name you like, Peterson replied harshly, but you're still wanted for questioning regarding incidents along the reservation boundaries. Dead or alive, Michael Thornton, you're coming back to face Governor Thornton and answer for your actions. Emma saw Mike's hand drift toward the knife at his belt and realized that he was preparing to fight rather than submit to arrest. The mathematical certainty of 6 armed marshals against one man, even a skilled warrior, meant that such a fight could only end in tragedy. Wait, Emma said desperately, her mind racing for some solution that might prevent bloodshed. What exactly is he accused of? What incidents are you referring to? Peterson hesitated, clearly unused to having civilians question his authority, but something in Emma's tone seemed to penetrate his official armor. Inciting resistance among reservation Indians, encouraging young warriors to leave the reservations and return to traditional ways of life, interfering with government efforts to implement new policies regarding tribal land usage. Emma felt a surge of anger at the vague nature of the charges. Those aren't crimes, she said indignantly. Those are political activities. Since when is it illegal for a man to express his opinions about government policy? Peterson's expression shifted to something approaching surprise, as if he hadn't expected a pregnant widow to challenge his interpretation of territorial law. Mrs. Hartwell, you don't understand the complexity of the situation. This man has been using his unique position to undermine government initiatives designed to bring peace and stability to the region. His unique position as what? Emma demanded, her teacher's instincts driving her to pursue the logic of Peterson's argument. As an educated Indian who understands both cultures? As someone capable of explaining government policies to tribal leaders in ways they can understand? As Governor Thornton's stepson, Peterson replied through gritted teeth. As someone whose very existence gives credibility to Indian resistance movements. Do you understand what it means when the territorial governor's own family member speaks out against government policy? Emma felt the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. Mike hadn't just been pressured to support government initiatives because of his education or political connections. He'd been pressured because his bloodline gave his opinions a weight that could influence territorial politics at the highest levels. You wanted to use him as a symbol, Emma said, her voice heavy with disgust. The governor's stepson who'd been saved from savage captivity and returned to civilization. Living proof that government policies were working, that Indians could be successfully integrated into white society. Mike's bitter laugh confirmed Emma's understanding. They wanted Michael Thornton to be their poster child for successful Indian assimilation. A white boy who'd been rescued from barbarism and transformed into a productive citizen. The fact that I preferred my Comanche family and education to what white society offered was an inconvenient complication. More than inconvenient, Peterson snapped. Dangerous. Every time you speak out against territorial policies, every time you encourage Indians to resist government initiatives, you give them hope that they can maintain their old ways of life. That kind of false hope leads to violence and bloodshed. Emma stared at Peterson in disbelief. False hope? Hope for maintaining their own culture and traditions. Sergeant, what you're describing isn't law enforcement, it's cultural genocide. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, and Emma could see that her words had struck home. Peterson's face reddened with anger, but she also caught a flicker of something that might have been shame. Mrs. Hartwell, Peterson said coldly, you're interfering with official territorial business. I'm going to give you one final opportunity to step aside and allow us to apprehend the fugitive. Emma looked at Mike, seeing in his eyes the same quiet courage that had driven him to refuse compromise with government officials who wanted to use his identity for their own purposes. This was a man who'd chosen principle over safety, integrity over comfort, and truth over convenience. And I'm going to give you one opportunity to leave my property peacefully, Emma replied, her voice steady despite the fear that made her knees weak. Mr. Nighthawk is my guest, and he's committed no crime that I can see. If the territorial government wants to question him, they can extend a proper invitation rather than sending armed men to drag him away like a common criminal. The tension that followed. Emma's declaration was so thick it seemed to press against her skin like humidity before a thunderstorm. 6 armed marshals faced 1 pregnant woman and 1 unarmed Indian, but somehow the numerical advantage didn't seem to matter as much as Emma had expected. Peterson's hand rested on his pistol grip, but Emma could see uncertainty in his eyes. Arresting a pregnant widow for harboring a fugitive would require paperwork and explanations that might prove difficult to justify, especially if the fugitive's only crimes were political in nature. Ma'am, one of the younger marshals said hesitantly, we have our orders. We're supposed to bring Michael Thornton back to Denver for questioning. Then you'd better find Michael Thornton, Emma replied with steel in her voice. Because the only person I see here is Michael Nighthawk, a Comanche warrior who's never been accused of any actual crime. Mike stepped closer to Emma, not in a threatening way, but in the gesture of solidarity that spoke louder than words. Emma, he said quietly, you don't have to do this. You don't have to risk everything for someone you barely know. Emma turned to look at him, seeing past the weathered face and traditional clothing to the man who'd shown her kindness when she'd needed it most, who'd shared his food and skills. without expecting anything in return, who'd treated her with respect and dignity when the rest of the world saw only a burden to be managed. "I know enough," she said simply. "I know you're a good man who's been caught between worlds through no fault of your own. I know you love your son, and you've tried to do right by both your peoples. And I know that sometimes the law and justice aren't the same thing." Peterson's jaw worked as he struggled with conflicting duties and practical considerations. Finally he said, "Mrs. Hartwell, harboring a fugitive is a federal crime. If you persist in this course of action, I'll have no choice but to place you under arrest as well." Emma felt the baby kick sharply, as if responding to her elevated heart rate and the adrenaline flooding her system. The practical part of her mind screamed that she was being foolish, risking not only her own freedom, but the welfare of her unborn child for the sake of a man she'd known for less than a week. But the deeper part of her soul, the part that had driven her to become a teacher and help children learn to think for themselves, knew that some stands had to be taken regardless of personal cost. Some principles were worth defending, especially when doing so required personal sacrifice. "Then I suppose you'll have to arrest a pregnant woman whose only crime was providing shelter during a storm," Emma said quietly. "I wonder how that will look in your official reports." Before Peterson could respond to Emma's challenge, the sound of another horse approaching at full gallop interrupted the tense standoff. All eyes turned toward the road as a single rider crested the hill, his horse lathered with sweat and his uniform marking him as a territorial courier. The courier reined in his mount just outside the circle of marshals, his chest heaving as Kofer. He struggled to catch his breath after what had obviously been a long, hard ride. "Sergeant Peterson," he gasped, "I have urgent orders from Governor Thornton's office." Peterson's attention shifted reluctantly from Emma and Mike to the winded courier. "What orders, Corporal?" The courier fumbled with his dispatch bag, withdrawing a folded document sealed with official wax. "The governor has rescinded the arrest warrant for Michael Thornton. You're ordered to return to Denver immediately for reassignment." Emma felt her legs go weak with relief, but she noticed that Mike showed no surprise at this development. His expression remained carefully neutral, as if he'd been expecting exactly this turn of events. Peterson snatched the document from the courier's hand, his face darkening as he read the official language that invalidated his mission. "This makes no sense," he muttered. The governor was adamant about bringing his stepson back for questioning. "Sir," the courier said hesitantly, "there's been a development. Apparently, someone with significant political influence has intervened on Michael Thornton's behalf." The order came directly from the territorial legislature, superseding the governor's authority. Emma looked at Mike sharply, seeing confirmation in his slight nod that he'd somehow arranged this intervention. His correspondence with territorial officials hadn't been limited to letters of defiance. He'd been working behind the scenes to protect himself and his son, through political channels she couldn't begin to understand. Peterson's face was a study in frustrated rage as he realized that his carefully planned capture had been undermined by forces beyond his control. "This isn't over," he said grimly, looking directly at Mike. "Political protection is temporary. Eventually, you'll have to face the consequences of your choices." "I face those consequences every day," Mike replied quietly. "The question is whether you'll face the consequences of yours." As the marshals prepared to withdraw, Peterson turned to Emma one final time. "Mrs. Hartwell, you've made a dangerous enemy today. I suggest you be very careful about the company you choose to keep in the future." Emma straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. "Sergeant, the most dangerous thing I've done lately is open my door to people who needed help. If that makes me your enemy, then I suppose I can live with that." And as the marshals rode away, their frustrated departure leaving dust clouds in the clear morning air, Emma realized that she'd crossed a line from which there could be no return. Whatever happened next, she was no longer just a pregnant widow trying to survive on the frontier. She was someone who'd chosen a side in a conflict, much larger than her small world had previously contained. After the marshals disappeared, over the hill, Emma found herself alone with Michael Nighthawk, or Michael Thornton, as she now knew him to be, and the weight of everything that had just transpired seemed to settle over her. Small homestead like morning fog. The man she'd thought she was beginning to understand had revealed himself to be someone far more complex and dangerous than she'd ever imagined. Mike stood motionless in her yard, staring at the dust clouds left by Peterson's retreat, his face a mask that revealed nothing of whatever emotions churned beneath the surface. Running Fox emerged from the cabin where he'd been hidden during the confrontation, moving to his father's side with the instinctive understanding of a child who'd learned to read adult moods for signs of danger. "You knew," Emma said suddenly, the realization hitting her with startling clarity. "You knew they were coming, and you knew the warrant would be rescinded. That's why you stayed calm during the whole confrontation." Mike's slight nod confirmed her suspicions. "I've been in communication with certain members of the territorial legislature who believe that Governor Thornton's personal vendetta against me has compromised his judgment. They arranged the intervention, but I wasn't certain it would arrive." In time, Emma stared at him in amazement. "You have allies in the territorial government. People powerful enough to override the governor's direct orders. What aren't you telling me?" Emma asked directly, too exhausted by the mornings, events to continue dancing around uncomfortable truths. "Because I think I deserve to know exactly what I've gotten myself involved in." Mike studied Emma's face for a long moment, as if weighing how much truth she could handle after everything she'd already experienced. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision that transformed his entire bearing from defensive wariness to something approaching trust. "My name is Michael Thornton Nighthawk," he said formally, as if introducing himself for the first time. "I am the adopted son of Chief Running Bear of the Southern Comanche, the biological stepson of Colorado Territorial Governor James Thornton, and the designated liaison between the territorial government and the tribal councils of the Southern Plains." Emma felt her breath catch as the full scope of Mike's identity became clear. "Liaison? You mean you work for the government? I work for peace," Mike corrected gently. "The territorial government appointed me to that position because they believed my background would make me an effective negotiator with tribal leaders. What they didn't anticipate was that I would refuse to be their puppet, that I would advocate for what I believed was right rather than what they wanted to hear." Running Fox had been listening to this conversation with the intense concentration of a child trying to understand adult complexities that affected his own safety. "Father," he said hesitantly, "are we in trouble because you won't lie to the Indian people about what the white government wants to do?" Mike's expression tightened with pain at his son's perceptive question. "We're in trouble because some people believe that being right is less important than being convenient. And because I've refused to choose between my white family and my Comanche family." Emma began to understand the impossible position Mike had been placed in by circumstances beyond his control. As Governor Thornton's stepson, he carried political weight that could influence territorial policy. As a Comanche warrior, he understood tribal concerns that white officials couldn't comprehend. A governor wanted you to convince the tribes to accept policies that would harm them, Emma said, piecing together the political puzzle. And when you refused, he decided you were a liability rather than an asset. Governor Thornton believes that the only path to peace is complete Indian submission to white authority. Mike replied with bitter accuracy. He sees my refusal to support that vision as betrayal of my white heritage and my family obligations. As the afternoon progressed, Emma began to understand that Mike's presence in her cabin represented far more than simple hospitality extended to storm refugees. She'd become an unwitting participant in a political chess game where the stakes involved the future of the entire Colorado territory. "How long can your allies protect you?" Emma asked as they sat around her small table, sharing a simple lunch that felt oddly normal after the morning's dramatic events. Mike's expression grew troubled. Not indefinitely. Governor Thornton has significant support among territorial officials who believe that harsh measures against Indian resistance are necessary for regional stability. My continued presence gives hope to tribal leaders who might otherwise accept unfavorable treaties, and that makes me a strategic problem. Emma felt a chill of understanding. They want to eliminate you not because you've committed crimes, but because your very existence complicates their political objectives. Exactly. Mike confirmed grimly. Dead martyrs are less troublesome than living symbols of resistance. If something were to happen to me, an accident, an attack by hostile Indians, a tragic misunderstanding during an arrest attempt, it would remove a significant obstacle to Governor Thornton's plans. The casual way Mike discussed the possibility of his own assassination made Emma's blood run cold. What about your son? What happens to Running Fox if something happens to you? Mike's face darkened with the particular anguish of a parent contemplating his child's uncertain future. My Comanche family would take him in, raise him as one of their own. But the reservation system makes that increasingly difficult. Traditional ways of life are being systematically destroyed, and children like Running Fox are being forced into government schools designed to eliminate their cultural identity. Emma thought about her own unborn child, about the hopes and fears that came with bringing new life into an uncertain world, and felt her heart break for the impossible choices Mike faced as a father. You're not just hiding from Governor Thornton, Emma said suddenly. You're still working against his policies. That's why you need to stay mobile, why you can't settle in one place permanently. Mike's slight smile confirmed her understanding. Information is a weapon, Emma. Knowledge about troop movements, policy changes, planned raids on Indian settlements. That information can save lives when it reaches the right people at the right time. That evening, as Emma prepared their simple dinner while Mike and Running Fox played a complex strategy game outside her cabin, she found herself wrestling with moral questions that had no easy answers. The man she'd taken in as a storm refugee had revealed himself to be someone whose activities directly challenged the authority of the territorial government. By providing him shelter and protection, she'd committed acts that could be interpreted as treason against the United States. Mike, she said as they gathered around her table for the evening meal, I need to understand something. The information you pass to tribal leaders, does it help them avoid violence, or does it help them prepare for war? Mike considered her question carefully before answering. It helps them make informed decisions about their own survival. Sometimes that means avoiding confrontations they can't win. Sometimes it means preparing to defend themselves against attacks they can't avoid. But the goal is always preservation of life and culture, not unnecessary bloodshed. Emma studied Mike's face, searching for signs of deception or self-justification, but found only the quiet certainty of someone who'd thought deeply about the moral implications of his actions. And you believe that what you're doing serves a greater good, even if it violates territorial law. I believe that laws which require people to collaborate in their own destruction are immoral laws. Mike replied with conviction. I believe that preserving human life and cultural diversity is more important than maintaining political convenience for government officials. Running Fox had been listening to this conversation with the serious attention of a child who understood that adult decisions would determine his own future. Father, he said quietly, are we bad people because we don't do what the white government wants us to do? Mike's expression softened as he reached across the table to touch his son's hand. We're people who've chosen to do what we believe is right, rather than what would be easy or safe. History will judge whether that makes us good or bad. Later that evening, as Emma rocked gently in her chair while Mike and Running Fox prepared their bedrolls by the fire, she realized that the choice she faced wasn't really about law versus morality, or safety versus principle. It was about the kind of person she wanted to be and the kind of world she wanted her child to inherit. Mike, she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. What if you didn't leave tomorrow? What if you stayed? Here, at least for a while. Mike looked up from adjusting Running Fox's blankets, surprise evident in his expression. Emma, you don't understand the risks. My presence here makes you a target for people who won't hesitate to use violence. To achieve their objectives, I understand the risks better than you think, Emma replied firmly. I also understand that some things are worth fighting for, especially when fighting is dangerous. Emma paused, placing both hands on her swollen belly as the baby shifted restlessly. I've been thinking about what kind of world I want my child to grow up in. Do I want it to be a world where people are punished for showing kindness to strangers? Where cultural differences are resolved through force and intimidation? I'm saying that my cabin is your cabin for as long as you need it, Emma replied with quiet determination. I'm saying that if the territorial government wants to arrest you for trying to prevent unnecessary suffering, they'll have to go through me first. Running Fox had been listening to this conversation with wide eyes. Does that mean we can stay? That we don't have to keep running? Emma saw the hope in the boy's face and felt her resolve strengthen. It means you have a home here for as long as you want it, Emma said gently, reaching out to touch Running Fox's cheek. It means that whatever happens, we'll face it together. Mike's eyes met Emma's across the firelit cabin, and she saw in them a complex mixture of gratitude, concern, and something else, recognition. Perhaps that their lives had become intertwined in ways that transcended simple hospitality. I understand that some choices define who we are, Emma said simply. And I choose to be someone who stands with people who are trying to do the right thing, regardless of the personal cost. And as the fire burned low and the three of them prepared for sleep in the small cabin that had become a refuge for more than just weather, Emma realized that she'd found something she hadn't known she was looking for, a purpose that transcended her own survival, and a family that had chosen her just as much as she'd chosen them. 3 weeks had passed since Emma made her fateful decision to harbor Mike and Running Fox permanently, and her small cabin had transformed into something she'd never expected, a real home filled with laughter, purpose, and the kind of domestic harmony she'd thought died with Jacob. The rhythms of their shared life had settled into comfortable patterns that felt as natural as breathing. Emma woke each morning to the sound of Mike splitting wood outside her window, his steady work providing fuel for the stove that kept them all warm as autumn deepened into the promise of winter. Running Fox had taken over the daily task of collecting eggs from the chickens Mike had repaired the coop for, chattering excitedly about each new discovery in his improving English. But it was the evenings that revealed how profoundly their lives had intertwined. After simple dinners prepared together, Mike proving surprisingly adept at cooking while Emma taught Running Fox to read from her precious books, they would gather around the fireplace where conversation flowed as easily as honey from a jar. Mike had begun teaching Emma basic Comanche words, his patient instruction revealing depths of his native culture that textbooks could never capture. In return, Emma shared stories from her teaching days, painting vivid pictures of children who'd struggled with lessons until the right approach unlocked their potential. You would make an excellent teacher among my people, Mike said one evening, watching Emma help Running Fox sound out difficult words in a McGuffey reader. Comanche children need educators who understand that learning comes from connection, not force. Emma felt her cheeks warm at the compliment, but also at something deeper in Mike's tone, a suggestion that she might have a place in his world, beyond their current temporary arrangement. The thought both thrilled and terrified her, especially as her pregnancy advanced and the baby's arrival grew nearer. Running Fox had become her devoted shadow, helping with household tasks and chattering about everything from the habits of prairie dogs to the mathematical principles his father taught him during their daily walks. The boy's presence filled empty spaces in Emma's heart she hadn't realized existed. Emma, Running Fox said one evening, looking up from the wooden horse he was carving under his father's guidance, When your baby comes, will you teach it? Comanche words too. The innocent question hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace, heavy with implications that none of them had yet dared to discuss directly. It was on a crisp October evening, with the first snow of the season dusting the mountains visible from Emma's doorway, that the careful boundaries they'd maintained around their growing feelings finally crumbled. Emma had been struggling to reach a heavy pot on a high shelf, her pregnancy making this simple task impossible. Mike appeared beside her instantly, his strong hands lifting the pot down with easy grace, but he didn't step away when the task was completed. Instead, he remained close enough that Emma could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could catch the scent of leather and wood smoke that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. "Emma," Mike said quietly, his voice carrying an intensity that made her look up into his dark eyes. "I need to tell you something before I lose the courage to say it." Emma's heart began hammering against her ribs, not with fear but with the recognition that whatever Mike was about to say would change everything between them. "What is it?" "I'm in love with you," Mike said simply, his words falling into the quiet cabin like stones dropped into still water. "I know the complications that creates. I know the impossibility of our situations, but I couldn't spend another day pretending that what I feel is merely gratitude or friendship." Emma felt tears spring to her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming relief of finally hearing spoken aloud what she'd been feeling for weeks. "Mike," she whispered, reaching up to touch his face with trembling fingers, "I love you too. I've been trying to convince myself it was just loneliness, just gratitude for your help, but—" Mike's hands cupped her face gently, his thumbs brushing away tears she didn't realize had begun to fall. "But it's more than that. It's the way you defend people who need protection, the way you teach running fox with such patience, the way you make this cabin feel like the first real home I've had since I was a child." When Mike kissed her, it was with a tenderness that acknowledged both the strength of their feelings and the fragility of their situation. Emma melted into his embrace, feeling for the first time since Jacob's death that she wasn't facing the world alone. Running Fox's delighted giggle from the doorway broke them apart, and they turned to find the boy grinning with the satisfaction of someone whose hopes had finally been confirmed. "Father, does this mean Emma will be my mother now?" Mike's expression grew complex as he looked at his son, clearly struggling with how to explain the difficulties their love would create. "It's complicated, Running Fox. Emma and I care for each other, but there are obstacles." "What obstacles?" Emma asked firmly, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. "We're both adults, both free to make our own choices." "What obstacles?" "Matter more than what we feel for each other." Mike's expression grew troubled as he gently took Emma's hands in his touch conveying both love and regret. "Emma, you don't understand what loving me would mean for your life, for your child's future. I'm not just any man you could choose to build a life with. You're the territorial governor's stepson and a Comanche warrior," Emma replied steadily. "You're someone caught between two worlds who's trying to do right by both. You're also the man I've fallen in love with, and those other things don't change how I feel." Mike shook his head, pain evident in his dark eyes. "It's not that simple. If we were to marry, if you were to take my name and become part of my life officially, you'd become a target for every enemy I've made in both worlds. Governor Thornton would see you as another way to pressure me into compliance." Emma felt a chill of understanding, but her resolve didn't waver. "And your Comanche family? How would they react to you taking a white wife? Some would welcome you, especially if you proved willing to learn our ways and respect our customs," Mike said honestly. "But others would see you as evidence that I've been corrupted by white influence, that I can't be trusted to put tribal interests first." Running Fox had been listening to this conversation with the serious attention of a child who understood that adult decisions would determine his own future. "But Emma already takes care of us," he said with simple logic. "She already lives like family. Why can't she just be family?" Emma knelt carefully beside the boy, her pregnancy making the movement awkward, but her need to connect with him overriding physical discomfort. Your father is worried about keeping us all safe, Running Fox. He's trying to protect us from people who might want to hurt us because of the choices we make. But if we don't make choices because we're afraid, Running Fox replied with wisdom. Beyond his years, then the bad people win anyway, don't they? Mike stared at his son in amazement, clearly struck by the simple truth in the boy's words. When did you become so wise? Emma's been teaching me about brave people in books. Running Fox replied matter-of-factly. They always have to choose between being safe and being right. And the good ones always choose being right, even when it's scary. Emma felt her heart swell with pride and love for this remarkable child who'd learned to find courage in stories. What do you think we should choose, Running Fox? The boy looked back and forth between his father and Emma, his young face serious with the weight of the question. I think we should choose to be a family, a real family. Because we're already brave enough to protect each other, so we're already strong enough to face whatever comes next. That night, after Running Fox had fallen asleep by the fireplace, Emma and Mike sat together on her small porch, wrapped in Jacob's old quilt and watching stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. The conversation they needed to have hung between them like morning mist, beautiful but fragile, Emma, Mike said quietly, his arm tightening around her shoulders as she leaned against his strength. If we do this, if we choose to build a life together, there's no going back. Once we make that commitment, we'll face whatever consequences come as a united front. Emma placed her hand over Mike's where it rested on her swollen belly, feeling their combined warmth surrounding the new life growing inside her. This baby will need a father, and Running Fox needs stability. But more than that, I need you. Not because I can't survive alone, but because surviving isn't the same as living. Mike turned to face her fully, his expression solemn in the starlight. Emma Hartwell, will you marry me? Will you take the name Nighthawk and help me raise Running Fox while we build a life that honors both our backgrounds? Emma felt tears of joy streaming down her cheeks as she nodded. Yes, Michael Nighthawk, I'll marry you. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving that love is stronger than the forces trying to tear us apart. When Mike kissed her this time, it was with the passion of a man claiming his future and the pilfindi tenderness of someone who understood the preciousness of what they were choosing to protect. Emma responded with all the love and determination she possessed, sealing their commitment with a promise that transcended words. We'll need to be married quickly, Mike said practically when they finally broke apart. Before word spreads about our arrangement, before anyone can interfere with our plans, Emma nodded, already thinking through the logistics. Reverend Morrison will perform the ceremony if we ask him. He's not the kind of man to refuse marriage to people who love each other, regardless of their backgrounds. And then, Mike asked, where do we go from here? How do we build a life together when both our worlds might reject us? Emma looked out at the mountains that surrounded their small valley, thinking about the challenges they would face and the strength they would need to overcome them. We build our own world, she said simply. Right here, in this place where we first found each other. We raise our children to be proud of both their heritages, and we prove that love really can bridge any divide as they sat together under the vast Colorado sky, planning a future that would require more courage than either had ever needed before. Emma realized that she'd never been more certain of anything in her life. Whatever storms lay ahead, they would weather them together as husband and wife, as partners in every sense of the word, and as living proof that some bonds were stronger than the forces trying to break them. 2 weeks later, on a crisp November morning with snow beginning to dust the Colorado peaks, Emma stood before the small mirror in her cabin, adjusting the simple white dress she'd sewn from fabric Mike had somehow procured from Denver. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the material over her now prominent belly, but her heart was steady with the certainty of the choice she was making. Running Fox burst through the door, his face glowing with excitement as he carried a bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers he'd gathered despite the early frost. "Emma, Father says the Reverend is ready," and Chief Two Eagles arrived with the blessing feathers. Emma's breath caught. "Chief Two Eagles is here?" "Mike's Comanche." "Father came. He traveled 4 days to witness the ceremony," Running Fox said proudly. "He says any woman brave enough to marry his son deserves the full blessing of both worlds." Through her window, Emma could see the small gathering that had assembled in her yard. Reverend Morrison stood beside a makeshift altar decorated with both Christian crosses and Comanche symbols, while Chief Two Eagles, a dignified man with silver braids and knowing eyes, waited patiently beside Mike. Mike himself stood tall and proud in clothing that bridged both his world's traditional Comanche wedding regalia combined with the formal vest Emma had seen him wear only once before. When he looked toward the cabin and caught sight of her in the window, his smile was radiant enough to warm the entire territory. "Are you ready to become my mother?" Running Fox asked with the directness that had endeared him to Emma from their first meeting. Emma knelt carefully and took the boy's hands in hers. "I'm ready to become your family in every way that matters. Are you ready to help me raise your new brother or sister?" Running Fox's grin was answer enough, and together they walked out into the crisp morning air where Emma's new life waited. The wedding ceremony that followed was unlike anything the Colorado Territory had ever witnessed, a beautiful fusion of Christian and Comanche traditions that honored both Emma's heritage and Mike's dual identity. Reverend Morrison spoke movingly about love that transcends cultural boundaries, while Chief Two Eagles offered blessings in the Comanche language that called upon the spirits of earth and sky to protect the new family. When Mike took Emma's hands and spoke his vows, his voice carried across the small gathering with quiet strength. "Emma, you opened your door to strangers in a storm and gave us more than shelter, you gave us hope. I promise to love you, protect you, and build with you a home where our children can be proud of all their heritage." Emma's own vows came from the depths of her heart. "Michael, you showed me that love isn't about choosing sides, but about choosing each other. I promise to stand with you against whatever comes, to honor both your worlds, and to raise our children to be bridges like their father." Chief Two Eagles stepped forward, placing eagle feathers in both their hair while speaking words that Running Fox translated in whispers. "He says the spirits have blessed this union because it brings two peoples closer together instead of driving them apart." When Reverend Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, the small crowd erupted in celebration that mixed Comanche ululations with frontier cheers. Emma had never felt more beautiful, more loved, or more certain that she'd chosen exactly the right path. The wedding feast that followed featured both Emma's cornbread and the traditional foods Chief Two Eagles had brought, creating a meal that celebrated the joining of two cultures through the love of two people brave enough to build something new. Spring had returned to the Colorado Territory, and Emma Nighthawk stood on her porch, now expanded and reinforced by her husband's skilled hands, watching Running Fox teach his baby sister, little Sarah, how to identify different bird calls. At 8 months old, Sarah was already showing signs of inheriting both her parents' intelligence and her brother's curious nature. Mike emerged from the expanded cabin, now twice its original size with proper bedrooms and a workshop where he crafted furniture to sell in Denver. His correspondence with territorial officials had evolved into legitimate consulting work, helping the government develop policies that respected tribal rights while maintaining regional stability. Letter from Governor Thornton, Mike said, holding up an official envelope with a mixture of amusement and satisfaction. "He's requesting a meeting to discuss my proposals for peaceful coexistence initiatives." Emma smiled, shifting baby Sarah to her other hip. "Your stepfather finally realized that working with you is more productive than working against you." "Took him long enough," Mike replied, wrapping his arms around both his wife and daughter. "But I think our success here building a life that honors both cultures has made him understand that integration doesn't require elimination." Chief Two Eagles, who had stayed through the winter and become a beloved grandfather figure, approached from the garden where he'd been teaching Running Fox traditional planting methods. "The boy learns quickly," he said with pride. "He will be a great leader someday, bridging worlds like his father." Emma looked around at her family, biological and chosen, Indian and white, bound together by love rather than blood or law, and felt her heart overflow with gratitude. The storm that had brought Mike and Running Fox to her door had indeed changed everything, transforming her lonely cabin into a home filled with laughter, purpose, and the daily miracle of love that transcended every boundary others had tried to impose. Emma, Running Fox called from his position, teaching Sarah about prairie flowers. "Tell her the story about the night we came to your door. Tell her how we all found each other." Emma settled into the rocking chair Mike had carved for her, gathering her children close while her husband and his Comanche father listened with smiles that spoke of contentment beyond measure. "Once upon a time," she began, "during the wildest storm anyone could remember, a pregnant widow let a rain-soaked Comanche and his boy sleep in her cabin for one night, never knowing he was the territorial governor's missing son who'd been declared dead for 15 years. But he wasn't really dead," Running Fox interrupted with delight, having heard this story countless times but never tiring of it. "No," Emma agreed, looking into Mike's eyes and seeing there the same love that had sustained them through every challenge. "He was just lost until he found his way home." And sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with a simple act of kindness during a storm.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.